Out of the fog, a massive grizzly appeared, silent, breath steaming in the cold air. But she wasn't there to attack. At her feet she laid down a dying cub, and then stepped back. What happened next will shock even those who think they've seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The fog hung like wet wool over the lake, muffling sound and softening the lines of the pine-studded shoreline. Clay Parker crouched by the rocks, his weathered hands tying off the last of his fishing lines. His movements were deliberate, practiced. Hands that once held the trembling fingers of a dying wife now steadied knots with quiet ritual. He wasn't out here to catch trout. Not really. The lake didn't offer much, not this late in the season. What it offered was silence, the kind that seeped into the bones and held back the tide of memory. He'd risen before dawn, as he always did. The air had smelled of pine and cold moss, of damp earth clinging to the past. The mist was thicker than usual, wrapping the water's edge like a shroud. As Clay moved to cast his first line, a crack of underbrush cut through the stillness like a blade. His spine stiffened. Not a branch dropping, not a deer. He knew the language of the forest well. This sound was slow, weighty, with the deliberate insistence of something with muscle and intent. His hand drifted to the revolver tucked beneath the flap of his coat, fingers brushing cool steel. He didn't move beyond that, didn't lift it. Just knowing it was there steadied his breath. Clay wasn't afraid of dying, hadn't been for years, but there were cleaner ways to go than by the jaws of a grizzly. And yet, when the figure materialized through the mist, towering and terrible, his breath caught not with fear, but with awe. She was immense, her shoulders rippling beneath a thick pelt knotted with old leaves and dried mud. Her sides rose and fell in ragged, shallow breaths. Her face, half-shadowed by the fog, was not contorted with rage or hunger. It was strained, drawn. And her eyes, those dark, deep-set eyes, held not the wild flicker of a predator, but something far stranger. She was not alone. At her side, cradled awkwardly between her forelegs, lay a cub. Small, limp, smeared with dried blood and dirt. One hind leg twisted at an unnatural angle. Its tiny chest fluttered as though each breath were a decision. The mother grizzly nudged it forward with her snout, then turned her gaze back to Clay. It was then that everything Clay thought he knew about animals, about grief, about the borders between man and beast, shifted. Because in her eyes, in that steady, desperate look, he didn't see danger. He saw a question. Clay's boots sank into the damp loam as he moved forward, each step deliberate, each breath held as though the wrong exhale might snap the fragile thread holding the moment together. The grizzly stood like a statue carved from the forest itself, muscle coiled beneath matted fur, her breath slow and visible in the cold air, fog curling around her like smoke from a pyre. But she didn't growl, didn't shift her weight. Her eyes tracked his every movement, but they held no malice. Only exhaustion, and something else, something ancient. Recognition, perhaps, or surrender. The cub lay crumpled at her feet like a discarded toy, small and broken against the cold stones of the shore. Clay could see now the damage in full, the mangled leg with shredded sinew and dried blood, the swelling that hinted at fever, the tremor in the small rib cage that spoke of a battle nearly lost. The wire had cut deep, deeper than most snares. Poacher's work, silent traps set in forgotten corners of the forest, meant for fur or flesh or cruelty. Clay had found a deer like that once. It hadn't survived. He crouched, slow and low, one knee pressing into the wet soil as he lowered himself beside the dying cub. From 10 feet away, he could smell the infection. Sour, metallic, like rusted iron in a stagnant pool. Flies had already begun to circle, cruel messengers of time's indifference. He resisted the urge to swat them away. Instead, he looked at the cub, really looked, its fur clotted and thinning, its eyes half-lidded but flickering, its breath little more than mist. Behind him, the mother exhaled, a guttural, haunting sound that didn't belong in nature. It was too heavy, too intimate. Clay's heart pounded in his chest, his skin alive with every possible outcome. He wasn't a vet. He wasn't even a medic. But he'd sewn up wounds before, on animals, on himself, on the woman he loved. And now, this. "I'm going to help him," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. He didn't expect her to understand. He barely understood them himself. But then the impossible happened. The mother grizzly took one slow step back, then another. Her front paw landed in the mud with a wet sound, her body retreating, not in fear but in deliberate solemn trust. She kept her eyes on him, steady and unreadable, then lowered her massive frame to the ground several paces away. It wasn't submission. It was permission. And Clay, heart trembling, leaned forward toward the cub, not as a hunter, not as a man in the wild, but as something else entirely. A witness. A bridge. A final hope. The shirt he used was old. Red plaid, threadbare at the cuffs, soft from years of wear. It had belonged to Mary once. Oversized on her, but she wore it in the mornings while the coffee percolated and the frost melted from the windows. Clay hadn't touched it in years, but today it became a cradle. He eased the cub into the fabric, bundling it against his chest with the care of a man handling explosives. The cub whimpered as its weight shifted, a breathy, pained sound that cut deeper than any claw could. Clay murmured something low and wordless, not meant for the cub, not really. More of a promise to the air, to himself. Then he stood, rising slowly, deliberately. The bear mother watched every motion, her muscles tensed like coiled rope. But she didn't move. She didn't need to. Her message had already been delivered. By the time Clay pushed through the cabin door, the cub's body had gone limp again. Not lifeless, but close. He laid it on a wool blanket beside the hearth, the fire already lit from the morning chill. The air inside smelled of cedar smoke, pine resin, and something sharper now, infection and blood. He worked quickly, with the practiced panic of someone who'd lost before. The lake water boiled over the stove in an old tin pot, steam curling upward like ghostly fingers. He added whiskey, cheap biting stuff he rarely touched except on sleepless nights, and poured it over the wound. The cub shuddered, not violently, weakly, like the last flicker of a candle against wind. Clay's fingers were not steady, not like they used to be, but they knew the rhythm of needle and thread. He retrieved Mary's sewing kit from the drawer beneath the sink. It still smelled faintly of lavender sachets, still held the small silver thimble she'd used with such precision. He threaded a curved needle with fishing line, sterilized it in the boiling water, then pressed it to torn skin. The cub didn't cry out, didn't flinch. Fever had dulled its senses. Clay sewed in silence, his jaw clenched so tight it hurt. He wasn't thinking about technique. He wasn't thinking about what came next. He was remembering Mary's last breath, the hospital bed, the quiet fight against inevitability. He was remembering helplessness, its taste, its weight, the unbearable truth of it. But this time, he had a body beneath his hands that could still be saved. This time, he wouldn't stand by. This time, he would act, even if it meant dying in a cabin alone, with a bear at the door and a cub in his arms. The cabin was quiet, but never still. The fire cracked softly in the hearth, casting amber light over the worn floorboards, dancing shadows across the cub's frail body as it lay bundled in the wool blanket. Clay barely slept. He sat in the rocking chair through most of those long hours, eyes red, hands folded but twitching with the phantom rhythm of worry. He spoke to the cub in hushed tones, half lullaby, half confession, stories about Mary, about fish that got away, about silence that pressed too hard on the soul when no one was left to fill it. The cub's fever broke just after dawn on the second day, a slick sheen of sweat along its brow, its chest rising with slightly steadier breaths. Clay let out a shudder that wasn't quite a sob. He didn't allow himself those anymore. But something cracked open nonetheless. Outside, the mother bear was a constant presence. She sat beyond the tree line, just far enough not to intrude, close enough to see. Her massive form like a sentinel carved from the mist. She didn't pace now. She waited. Her head would tilt when Clay stepped outside to gather firewood. Her ears twitched when the cub whimpered. But she held her ground. It wasn't trust in the human sense. It was something purer. It was hope, suspended between instinct and something older. On the third morning, the cub stirred before Clay did. A soft scrape of claw on floorboard pulled his eyes open. He turned just in time to see it push up on trembling legs, sway, then steady itself against the warm belly of the wood stove. Its eyes were glassy but alert. It blinked slowly, then let out the smallest rasping breath, a sound not of pain, but persistence. Clay didn't speak. He only moved. He wrapped the cub in a thick towel and stepped onto the porch. The sun was struggling to break through the haze, but the light was there, thin and golden, slicing the fog like a whispered promise. The mother bear rose the moment the door creaked open. Her body uncurled with a grace no beast that large should have, and she stood at her full height, towering yet still. Clay felt the weight of her presence like gravity itself. He placed the cub gently on the mossy earth, then stepped back. The world held its breath. She approached with slow, deliberate steps, each one a vow. She sniffed the cub once, twice, then brushed her massive snout along his side, licking the stitched wound with the tenderness of memory. The cub chirped, then leaned into her fur. A soundless embrace passed between them, ancient and complete. Then she turned to Clay, her gaze locked with his, deep, solemn, unfathomable. And slowly, she dipped her head, not low enough to show fear, just enough to show something else, a gesture beyond language, a benediction in fur and silence. Clay didn't move, and when they turned and disappeared into the mist, not once looking back, he remained where he was, arms limp, throat tight. For the first time in 3 years, the stillness around him felt whole. Something had returned to him, not Mary, not youth, not time, but grace. And that, somehow, was enough.